The invitation arrived in an unmarked envelope, the paper thick and whisper quiet when Marcus Greer slid it across his desk. He had seen many strange things in his years covering crime and power for the Washington Ledger, but nothing like this. The card inside bore a name that still made his pulse quicken: Jeffrey Epstein, accompanied by a single line in elegant script: "I'll tell you everything," with Frank Caprio. There was a date, a time, an address that didn't exist in any public registry. Greer stared at the card, and then at his reflection in the window that looked out over the city at dusk. He should ignore it. He should toss it. He should call his editor and tell her he'd lost his mind. Instead, he packed his bag and left. Outside, the winter air was sharp and unkind. The city hummed with the usual rhythms of late December: ambulances wailing in the distance, car horns like nervous ticks, the buzz of lights on Monument Avenue. Greer hailed a cab and tried not to think about how he was about to walk into the unknown. Journalists didn't get second chances at secrets like this, not in his world. The address led him down a labyrinth of streets that seemed to drift farther from the familiar. Buildings sagged under the weight of time. Windows stared back like unblinking eyes. Finally, he arrived at a gate that looked like it belonged to a long-abandoned estate. An old man in a worn coat stood beside it, his breath in misty spirals. "You Greer?" the man asked, voice gravelly. "I am," Greer said. "You're late." Greer checked his watch. 2 minutes, maybe. "Time changes when you're waiting for truth," the man said. Then he opened the gate. Inside, the estate was grand in its decay: marble floors marred by cracks, chandeliers dusty as relics. Somewhere in the distance, the soft hum of a generator and the faint scent of electricity hung in the air. Greer's phone buzzed, but he didn't look at it. "You've been asked to record," the man continued. "No cameras. Audio only. You follow every word." He opened another door, revealing a room lit by a single overhead lamp. In the center, at a long table, sat two figures. One was Jeffrey Epstein. The other was Frank Caprio. Epstein looked older than his last public image, gaunter, eyes like embers that refused to die. Caprio, the reticent judge known for his unflappable calm and meticulous gaze, sat across from him, a recorder between them. Greer felt his pulse accelerate, not from fear, but from the gravity of what might unfold. Caprio spoke first. "You requested this meeting." Epstein nodded, his fingers steepled. "I did." "Why now?" "What do you think?" Caprio's jaw tightened. "I think you want control of the narrative before someone else does." Epstein smiled, not pleasant, but calculating. "Perhaps, or perhaps I want to unburden myself." Greer flipped open his notebook and hit record on his old digital device. Epstein paused, gaze lifting to the lone light overhead. "The world thinks it knows the truth. They think they've seen every document, every indictment, every testimony. They think they understand what happened, who was involved, why it happened, how deep it goes, but they have not heard everything." Caprio didn't react. He just waited. Epstein's voice dropped. "I'll tell you everything." And with those words, the room seemed to contract, as though the shadows themselves leaned closer. The first hours were cautious. Epstein recounted events with a surgeon's precision: dates, names, meetings, transactions. Caprio interjected only to clarify, to push back, to probe deeper where necessary. Greer transcribed, his pen a blur. Epstein's revelations were staggering, not in a salacious way, but in how they illuminated the architecture of influence and power that had shielded him. Not just the wealthy and the famous, but networks woven through finance, government, private security, and global philanthropy. He spoke of meetings held in boardrooms and salons, not bedrooms. He described leverage built on secrets, not just on violations of law. Every claim was backed with a reference, a ledger entry, an email thread, a ledger of ledgers. It was organization on a scale that made Greer's head swim. By the time the first light of dawn crept through the cracks in the curtains, Epstein paused and looked at Caprio. "You see why I had to do this with you?" he said. Caprio remained impassive. "Your timing is curious." "Time is a luxury I no longer possess." Greer glanced at Caprio for a reaction, but the judge's face was a studied mask. Epstein continued, I've made calls. Portions of this will go public whether I agree to it or not. I'd rather supply it in a controlled narrative, tested by someone with a legal mind. Caprio tapped the recorder. The public will judge. The magnitude of what Greer was holding pressed down on him. This was not a scoop. This was a reckoning. Epstein offered a brief, sardonic laugh. I suppose journalists today want virality over veracity, he said. But you, Greer, you want the story. Greer didn't know how Epstein knew his name. He only knew one thing. If even half of what Epstein had said was true, the consequences would be seismic. Caprio stood. I will need time to verify these claims, he said. Epstein nodded. I expected nothing less. Until then, Caprio continued, this stays here. Epstein rose slowly. I'll tell you everything. His voice was softer now, almost weary. But I want assurances that when the world sees this, it sees the truth, not some caricature fed by those who would profit from distortion. Caprio looked at Greer, then back at Epstein. We proceed with facts, Caprio said. Nothing more, nothing less. Epstein's expression tightened, not in antagonism but resolve. Then we are agreed. Greer's recorder blinked, its red light unwavering. The room was silent, and outside, the world continued, unaware that the first chapter of a new revelation had just been written. By the time Greer stepped back into the street, the city had changed without asking his permission. Dawn had burned off the last traces of night, and with it any illusion that what he had just witnessed could be neatly contained. His phone vibrated again, insistently now. Missed calls, messages stacking on top of each other, editors, colleagues, unknown numbers. Something was already moving, and he hadn't sent a single word yet. He ducked into a cafe 2 blocks away, ordered black coffee he didn't taste, and listened to the room around him. People scrolled, people whispered, screens glowed. On a muted television above the counter, a headline ticker crawled by with the familiar rhythm of outrage and distraction. But then it changed. A single phrase flashed, then vanished, then returned. Unconfirmed audio clip claims Epstein prepared to tell everything. Greer felt his stomach tighten. Someone had leaked the existence of the meeting. Online, the reaction was instantaneous and feral. Hashtags splintered into rival camps within minutes. Some called it a fabrication, a psyop designed to muddy waters that had already settled. Others framed it as a last confession, a digital deathbed statement meant to detonate long after the speaker was gone. Clips with ominous music and grainy stock footage surged across feeds, each claiming exclusive insight without a shred of verification. The truth was already being buried under its own anticipation. Greer closed his laptop and stared into the coffee. Caprio had warned him about this exact moment. The public didn't wait for facts anymore. It devoured implications. What was going viral right now wasn't evidence, but the idea that evidence might exist. That alone was enough to fracture trust, to reopen wounds that had never fully healed. He returned to his apartment and locked the door behind him, as if that could keep the noise out. He replayed sections of the audio through headphones, listening not just to Epstein's words, but to what sat between them, the pauses, the careful phrasing, the moments where Caprio redirected, grounding the conversation before it drifted into spectacle. This wasn't a rant. It was structured, deliberate. That terrified Greer more than any emotional outburst could have. Hours later, Caprio called. His voice was steady but stripped of pleasantries. He asked Greer if anything had leaked from his end. Greer said no, and Caprio believed him. That left other possibilities, none of them comforting. Epstein, ever the strategist, had likely anticipated the chaos and seeded just enough information to force attention without surrendering control. Even in disclosure, he was negotiating. Caprio instructed Greer to prepare transcripts, not summaries, verbatim. Every word would be scrutinized. Anything that couldn't be corroborated would be flagged, not amplified. This was not a media blitz. It was a legal and moral minefield, and Caprio intended to walk it inch by inch. As evening fell, the viral storm intensified. Influencers posted reaction videos filmed in cars and bedrooms, eyes wide, voices shaking with manufactured disbelief. Politicians issued preemptive denials without being named. Anonymous accounts surfaced claiming first-hand knowledge, each contradicting the last. The algorithm rewarded certainty, not accuracy. Greer watched the lie ecosystem build itself in real time, faster and louder than truth ever could. Late that night, Greer returned to the recordings. In one segment he hadn't fully processed before, Epstein spoke about power not as an object, but as a current. He described how institutions didn't collapse under scandal, they adapted. How silence was rarely enforced through threats, but through incentives. Careers preserved, futures implied, lines blurred until accountability became abstract. Caprio challenged him sharply in that moment, questioning intent, questioning credibility. Epstein didn't argue. He acknowledged his guilt without dramatics, then pivoted to something colder. He spoke about systems that would survive him untouched unless exposed in full. Not to cleanse them, he said, but to force them into the open, where sunlight could at least make denial harder. Greer realized then why this was resonating so violently online. The viral moment wasn't Epstein. It was the implication that the story everyone thought had ended was still unfinished, that the villain might be only one node in a much larger network. People weren't chasing justice. They were chasing coherence, a narrative that explained why so much had felt unresolved. Just before midnight, a new clip began circulating, allegedly from the meeting. Greer recognized the words instantly, but not the context. The clip was edited, trimmed to provoke outrage, stripped of Caprio's response. Epstein's voice alone declaring, "I'll tell you everything," looped over dramatic music. Millions watched it within hours. None of them heard what came next. Greer shut off his phone. Tomorrow they would begin releasing the truth the slow way. Verified, documented, uncomfortable. It wouldn't trend the same way. It wouldn't satisfy those hungry for instant catharsis, but it might endure. And in a world addicted to virality, endurance had become a radical act. Morning arrived without ceremony. No dramatic knock, no flashing lights, no urgent summons. Just a pale wash of sunlight across Greer's desk and the quiet understanding that the next choices would define the rest of his career. He showered, dressed, and sat down to work with the discipline of someone who knew emotion was a liability. The transcript grew line by line, unembellished, resistant to interpretation. Words on a page. That was all he allowed himself. By noon, Caprio convened the final call. No lawyers grandstanding, no media consultants chasing angles, just verification, cross-referencing, dates checked against records that had never been meant to see daylight. Some claims collapsed under scrutiny and were cut without mercy. Others hardened, gaining weight with every confirmation. The truth that survived was narrower than the internet wanted, but far more dangerous than rumor. Outside that room, the viral wave began to crest and then fracture. Audiences grew restless. The lack of spectacle frustrated them. New controversies competed for attention. The phrase that had dominated feeds for 48 hours started slipping down timelines, replaced by the next outrage, the next distraction. Virality, Greer realized, was loud but fragile. It burned hot and fast, then vanished. That evening, the release went live. No countdown. No teaser, a plain statement, verified excerpts, context intact. Caprio's questions included. Epstein's words stripped of mystique, presented not as a confession seeking absolution, but as testimony weighed and constrained by fact. It landed quietly, almost anticlimactically, but it landed. Investigators took notice. So did institutions that had counted on exhaustion and confusion to protect them. Subpoenas followed, reviews reopened. Not because the public demanded blood, but because the record now existed in a form that could not be waved away as hysteria. The system moved slowly, as it always had, but it moved. Greer watched the numbers with professional detachment. The release never matched the clip's reach. It never trended the same way. But something subtler happened. The noise receded, and in its place came a colder, more sustained attention. Journalists stopped speculating and started asking narrower questions, the kind that required answers. Late that night, Greer listened to the final minutes of the recording one last time. In them, Epstein's voice had lost its edge, not remorseful, not defiant, simply aware. A man recognizing that control ends not with exposure, but with irrelevance. When the recorder clicked off, there was no dramatic farewell, just the sound of a chair moving, footsteps, a door closing. Greer shut the file and powered down his computer. The story was no longer his to shape. It belonged to process now, to institutions that would either act or reveal themselves by their inaction. That was the real outcome. Not a viral reckoning, not a collective gasp, but a permanent mark in the public record that could not be unseen. As he turned off the light, Greer understood the quiet truth beneath the chaos. The most explosive moments are rarely the loudest. They are the ones that refuse to disappear, long after the crowd has moved on, sitting patiently, waiting for the world to catch up. And this time there was no erasing it.